Hello and welcome to the GSE Grays podcast. Today we are talking about succession with Managing Director Guy Coggrave. During the conversation, he talks about how farmers can start on their succession journey. He gives some really good advice to existing farmers and the next generation on how to get that awkward conversation started. And he also gives some examples of where things can go really, really wrong when people don't start to have the conversation early enough. The GSE Grays podcast is for farmers, landowners and their advisors and anyone with a general interest in agriculture. Without further ado, let's talk about succession with Guy Coggrave. Guy, for those who don't know you already, although I'm sure they do, could you just give a brief introduction for the people listening?
Yeah, of course. So I'm Guy Coggrave. I'm the Managing Director at GSE Grays. I established GSE Chartered Surveyors in 2004, which then became GSE Grays in 2011. And so effectively I've been running part of the business for 20 years now. So
Oh, blimmin' heck, yeah, it's a long time.
a long time. And I'm involved in all aspects of the business. So I advise a number of estates. I advise a lot of farmers. And previously, I set up the agency when that first started. So.
And what makes you the person to speak to about succession today instead of anyone else in the rest of the business?
Well, there's a number of people in the business that are very capable of speaking about succession.
Of course.
But it's an area that I particularly enjoy getting involved with, and work with a number of families on developing succession plans and helping businesses look at that sort of long-term continuity, which succession really is all about. So it's an area I enjoy, and I enjoy working with clients on. And it helps if you have that long-term relationship to be able to help those businesses really understand what they're trying to achieve.
Okay, and what do we mean by succession? It feels very final, or it's also like that TV show that everybody seems to be watching. So what do we mean when we're talking about succession?
I think succession means different things to different people and to different businesses. And I think it's really important to understand what is succession to a particular circumstance in business. And succession is really talking about continuity. And for some people, that'll be really clear what that succession is. It might be that there's son and daughter already involved in the business, and the plan's very clear that the intention is for them to take on that business and carrying it forward. For others, it might be a lot more difficult. Children may not be involved in the business yet, they might be too young, or it might be that the business is struggling financially to support more than one generation. So what does that look like? And I think it's quite interesting to compare that to other sectors and other industries where they wouldn't really talk about succession. They would talk about what is the exit strategy for the current incumbent.
Okay.
And I think that's maybe a more appropriate way of looking at succession, because succession is one of those exit strategies, but there's multiple strategies businesses could look at. Is the business suitable to pass on to the next generation? Is it financially viable? Is it the right individuals to take that on? Does that fulfill the owner's obligations or aspirations? Whereas there may be other options that are better suited to that business. So I think succession is one of the exit strategies. But why is it so important to think about is how you would run and operate a business would be very different depending on what your exit strategy is. So, for example, if someone came to speak to us and said, well, in 5 to 10 years' time, I'd like to retire and I don't have anyone suitable to take on the business, the advice we'd look to give them might be very different to the advice we'd give to somebody who was very clear that their son or daughter or nephew, niece, or whoever that might be, would take that business forward. And the investment they would make into that business would be more looking at the long-term continuity of the running of it.
Okay.
Whereas a client that maybe was looking at an alternative structure, they might look at how to maximise the value for a sale or how to get the maximum rent, etc. So understanding the exit for the current business owner, I think, is really important, and succession may be one of those scenarios.
Okay. So that felt very much like everything we need to know about succession in one statement. So I'm going to pull that apart a little bit, because that was a lot of information all in one go. And it was all really good stuff. So succession to me, when it comes to sort of, we're talking about farms, we're talking about estates, and it's very much a family it's a family mixed up with a business.
Yes.
And they're two separate things, but within that kind of estate and farm dynamic, the two of them collide. And it's almost like taking a will and a business plan and putting them together. Or that's what it feels like. And perhaps that's why it's so complex. So, how do we help businesses sort of break those two things apart? Is that perhaps sometimes how we approach it? Or
Well, I think the first thing you need to think about in any business is continuity. So there's how does a business work and operate today, and how do you manage the situation if the inevitable happens that somebody is either struck down ill or sadly no longer here, and what then happens thereafter. And that's dealing with the immediate issue of a potential scenario arising, and then there's what is the longer term plan for the business in the future.
And so that's more like a will.
So that would be things like looking at making sure there was a clear will, but also really importantly, lasting powers of attorney. So if something was to happen to the key decision maker, who can make decisions? How do those decisions get made? What impact does that have on the finances of the business, for example? And really just making sure there's clarity as to how the business can operate if someone's not available or through either ill health or no longer here. So they're key considerations that need to be in place, and they need reviewing regularly, and they will change. So the wills, who's authorised as lasting power of attorney, should be reviewed on a very regular basis.
Okay.
But similarly, looking at the business structure, the partnership agreement, what does that state? Who has what rights, what abilities? If it's not a partnership, what are the articles of association? How does that business continue to operate and run? So that's, I would say, the operational. How do we keep going? How do we operate? And then the succession piece is more about what happens in the future, and that might be very clear, as I said earlier, or that might be something that has to evolve over time. But the business needs to remain live and flexible to be able to adjust.
Okay. And then you mentioned an exit strategy, and that's how when you're looking at just purely looking at a business, it's like, well, how do you want to move forward? What's your end goal, if you like? And so sort of applying that to farming businesses, succession, people mostly think of handing the asset over to the next generation, but that's not necessarily going to be the best or the right outcome for many farms and estates. So it doesn't have to, succession doesn't necessarily mean handing the asset over, does it?
No, it doesn't. And there's a number of options for people. But I think, going back to a comment I think you made earlier, a lot of the businesses we're referring to have been family businesses and held by a family for a very long time. So often, I think the current incumbent feels an obligation to make sure that they are able to pass over that business to the next generation. And I think that's become more complicated in more recent times, where it's more expected that children are treated more fairly and equally, whereas over previous generations, it might be that the eldest son, for example, would be left the family farm. So there's another layer of complication, I think, in modern day life than what there has been previously. And so if an asset is to be broken up because there's a number of children, or if alternative arrangements need to be made, then I think it's really important that those conversations and that planning for that happens early, and that then enables the sort of businesses to adapt and to adjust. So I think that partly answers your question.
Yeah, I think so. I guess what I'm saying is succession isn't just about handing over to the next generation. It's also exit strategy, meaning, how do you come out of the business but also continue to be provided for?
Yeah.
Or, actually, is everybody keen on taking the farm onto the next generation, or is the best decision for that to be split in order to, is now the time to... There's lots of different outcomes, isn't there? And it depends on what the end goal is and what the circumstances are and what people need from the arrangement. So it's not as straightforward as it is.
It's certainly not straightforward, and it's very bespoke to the individual business. And I think it's really important that you understand the objectives that you are all wanting to achieve within that business and have really open dialogue. And there's a number of examples where we've worked with clients and son, daughter want to get involved in the business, but the reality is that the business can't justify supporting another generation. And so what can we do? How do we look at that? And is it that we need to think about alternative income streams that can be brought into the business. Some really good examples we've had is where we've managed to do a good renewables project, for example, that will generate an income that's different to the core business, that then provides effectively a pension for the elder generation that want to retire. We've looked at sort of diversification farm shops, for example, where the next generation will come in and generate an income that supports their business, and it's a diversification that supports the next family coming in. So it's understanding what are the needs of those within the business and then how best to get to that point.
So Jake, who was on the podcast, on the most recent edition of the podcast, and we're looking at extensification or intensification, gave a really lovely example of a dairy farm that had sort of brought the kids in quite early, had sat down and sort of said, right, these are the things that we need to achieve. How are we going to let the parents step back and the kids sort of move the business forward? And in that example, because they'd sort of done it early enough, they were able to look at diversification projects as you've outlined, and everybody clearly knew where they stood. So there's some really nice success stories of where that's been done really, really well. I guess I'd like to understand what are the main barriers to people having those conversations when we see lots of really good success stories of where the outcome's been really good. It seems,
So I think the barriers are uncertainty, and so that can come in lots of different forms. It might be the son who's just starting to get involved in the business, might be slightly wild, and I refer to an example often when I'm speaking to clients that individuals can be very sociable at a certain stage.
Indeed.
They can perhaps have a fiance that the family aren't concerned about, or
new people coming into
the family, etc. So there's a lot of uncertainty at certain times in people's lives that actually bring questions as to, is it the right thing to do? And also finances are a big factor, and can the business afford it, etc. So I think uncertainty means that it delays people making those decisions, and then in my experience that creates a lack of clarity, and then sometimes that can mean that the business isn't as successful as it can be. And where I think we've seen great success stories is where you've got capable individuals and there's clarity as to the direction of travel, and people have been given the opportunity to really influence and have an impact on the business at an earlier stage in their career. I think often leads to the greatest success stories.
So then somebody who's thinking about succession and handing over and there is uncertainty, but still their exit strategy is for that business to be handed over. How do they begin this process? How do they mitigate the uncertainty?
So I think for me, the starting point is to what is the overall objectives? What's the overall plan? How do they want to get to their end game? And if there are areas within that are uncertain at the moment, then that structure that they've created needs to remain agile and flexible, but there needs to be a general direction of travel.
Okay.
And if it's that they're waiting to see how their son, daughter evolves, develops their skill sets, for example, or if they're wanting to understand what another brother and their children are wanting to do, or can the business financially afford to achieve the goals we're looking at, it's making sure they're working to a plan to try and achieve that, and set up a structure that can be successful, but not be limited to the fact that it might need to change and flex, because things do change. And there needs to be flexibility.
So what does change and flex look like? So what structures can be put in place to allow that to happen?
So, for example, do you get children involved in the business, but perhaps protect the asset? Okay. So the asset sits outside of the business that they're involved in. Do you give them a small area within the business to start to run and develop the skills? Make sure they understand all the financials around that. Make sure they're responsible for it, accountable, so that if in time they take on a bigger part of the business, you've developed those skill sets, and you've effectively trialed how they're going to work and perform, and hopefully give them the opportunity to grow and develop what they want to do as well, which is really important.
Okay. That sounds like really good advice. So then, so there's obviously two generations involved in succession. I think the next generation are obviously much keener to talk about it than the existing generation. But what other advice would you give the existing generation? So we've sort of talked about how you can put structures in place to maintain that flex, looking at schemes, sort of looking at the end game as to what people want to achieve, looking at diversifying in order to bring other income schemes in order to be able to retire. Is there anything else that you would sort of say that needs to be looked at?
Yeah, I think from the elder generation, it's understanding what their current position is as well. So I think people work really hard to develop their business and often have a plan where they would like that business to go. I think it's really important that they're open and communicate that with the next generation, and that they listen to what the younger generation have to say and respect that, as well as taking on board their own views. But also, there's a huge amount of work done to develop these businesses and assets, and it'd be a real shame for it to go wrong when they retire or if they're no longer here, because it hasn't been properly planned for or prepared for, and also understanding what the implications are of their demise. And so, is there a huge tax burden? Is there a big tax liability? Has that been sort of properly considered? Have they taken proper advice from their accountants? Have they put the wills in place? Have they considered whether actually a trust structure would be the right thing for the asset to go into?
Yeah.
Or are they going to pass it down? So I would say the key thing for the senior generation is to think about what do they want to happen and how do they want that to happen and how do they mitigate all the risks associated with that.
Okay. And the earlier they start doing that, the better.
Far better. And particularly when we talk about sort of how does a business develop towards the future, if there's not a clear understanding as to how you develop a business towards your exit, then are you effectively doing the best for the next generation, if that is your intention, whatever that might be, whether that's them taking on the business or actually that you would like to make sure they have sufficient when you retire from the business and you may want to exit and you want to get the most value to the next generation, then that's a very different strategy perhaps to making sure that there's continuity in the business.
Because we're sort of seeing quite a bit through our Farm Business Advice Service scheme that quite often the next generation aren't necessarily interested in taking on the farm, are they? And that's causing some problems, and then farmers are having to look at different ways of creating that sort of exit strategy, looking at how to keep the farm going, but also to support themselves. And that's where perhaps we might see some environmental schemes come into play. And what are the implications of those, Guy?
Okay, so from an environmental scheme perspective, it's been a big concern if people have gone into either sort of very extensive environmental management options or looked at some of the private sector financing as to whether that would qualify for agricultural property relief from an inheritance tax perspective. Helpfully, the government have just announced that land that's managed for those environmental schemes certainly the public schemes will qualify for agricultural property relief.
That's good news.
And the restructuring, the definition of that, which will take effect from 2025. So I think that relieves that element of concern.
Yeah.
The only thing that we would sort of be mindful for is that a lot of those private sector schemes are quite long term and will have quite significant bearings on the future use of the land.
Yeah, it's like 30 years plus, isn't it?
30 years plus. And a lot of those changes that will be made will probably be very difficult to reverse in 30 years' time. So they are locking up the business and the flexibility within the business for quite significant periods of time.
And there will be liabilities involved in that, won't there? Because, you're sort of committed to achieving certain objectives. So that will have to continue, I suppose.
Absolutely. I mean, that will pass on to whoever takes on the business or whoever in due course may look to acquire the assets that those options lie on. And so that's going to have an impact on capital values potentially as well.
Absolutely.
In some cases, that might be positive, depending on what income sits with it, or in other cases, it could be detrimental.
Okay. So then the next generation, the ones who are the most incentivized in order to get this sort of stuff sorted out, and what would the advice that you would give to them?
So I think for the next generation, I think it's understanding, again, what do they want to achieve? What are their goals and what are their aspirations? But I certainly believe, and often the conversation comes from the younger generation wanting to stimulate the conversation with the senior. How do they approach it, first of all? And sometimes that's a really difficult conversation to have with family members. and I often say it's actually getting people all sat around the table and having those discussions. And sometimes that's easier to have with a third party that helps facilitate those discussions. It maybe controls the environment for those discussions to happen, but also creates a safe space for people to say what they want to say, and everyone hopefully engage in that process. So I think the starting point is make sure you have those conversations, and if that's difficult to do, probably bring someone in to help facilitate that. And then I think what's really important is that they understand what the senior generation's aspirations are. You don't want to commit 10, 15 years of your life to working within the family business to find that actually what you thought was going to happen doesn't happen, and the business isn't there for you to take over in the way that you'd hoped. And it's those sorts of scenarios that we come across that cause such resentment and family fallouts, which could have been so easily avoided by everybody sitting around the table and having a conversation.
Clarity both ways is so important.
Yeah, and second guessing each other is not a sensible solution.
Okay, so from that starting point, I think you've already given some really good advice for both sides. If someone's not ready to bring in a third party and wants to kind of make a start, just even sort of beginning to think about succession, but it feels overwhelming and probably a bit frightening, to sort of be thinking about that. How could they start to get the ball rolling?
I think probably a really good starting point is with a blank piece of paper.
Okay.
And to just start with a blank piece of paper as to what are your desires, what would you like to see happen, and also on the other side of the piece of paper to sort of list all the assets that you have and where you'd like those assets to eventually end up, and I think that process will start to get people thinking about what they would like to leave as their legacy, and who they would like to support within that, and what does that look like. And then that will start to influence that thought process.
Yeah, so you sort of work backwards from that.
Yeah. So, and I think most people they'll have a clear understanding in their own mind what they'd really like to happen if they were no longer here. But starting to commit that to paper as a thought process, I think is something that people rarely do until sat with advisors. And I think that's something that they can do at an early stage.
Okay. When it comes to succession advice, what is the best advice you've ever heard, and what is the worst advice you've ever heard?
I think the worst is easy. I think the worst is do nothing and sit and wait and see what
hope
happens.
For the best, yeah.
And I think that keeps agents, solicitors, accountants very busy, and we all make reasonable amounts of fees in those scenarios because it takes a lot of unpicking and sorting out when things haven't been planned properly.
Yeah. It can get very expensive, upsetting, and just messy.
Very stressful. And it's such a pull on the family, and there's such amount of energy and effort wasted really on something that could have been far easier addressed. And I think often it isn't addressed because it's too difficult to have those conversations, but it's far more difficult when somebody's no longer here saying what they would like to have happened for people to try and work that out. So I think the worst advice is do nothing. The best advice, in my view, is to have a plan early. That plan needs to have flex, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to make firm commitments as to who may succeed, etc. But at least if you create a framework that enables that. And an example of that is if, for example, you've decided that a member of the family who may not want to be involved in the farm business, but you'd like to try and treat maybe not equitably but fairly.
Yeah.
If decisions are made around that at a relatively early stage, things can be done that can create other investments and other opportunities outside of the farming business that would support that individual, that would enable the farming business to continue without being put under undue stress or pressure at the time where there needs to be a change. And so planning early, I think, makes a huge amount of difference to the options that are available to a business and to the family members involved.
So Guy, thank you for that. You mentioned the tenanted sector, and obviously succession looks quite different for those people. Could you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, of course. So I think if the family business or if the farm involves tenanted land, that could be on an Agricultural Holdings Act tenancy, where there are very clear rules around succession, depending on the type of tenancy and the age of the tenancy, whether there's succession rights within it. And I think certainly where there is an intention that a member of the family will succeed that tenancy and there's the ability to do so, it's really important that early preparation is done to make sure that the individual is in a position where they can qualify for succeeding the tenancy.
Okay.
And there's key set criteria around that is really important that they look at. Is it their principal source of livelihood? Have they earned their principal income from there for 5 out of the last 7 years, some of which can be at university. So they're examples of criteria that they will need to meet. Where it's perhaps a farm business tenancy, there may not be the opportunity to succeed, or it might be that there is, but they need to probably have those conversations at a relatively early stage, I would say, with their landlord.
Okay.
Because loss of that tenancy could have a significant impact on the business and also their future within the business.
And that helps the landlord with their future planning as well, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
If they've got a clear successor.
And also be open to alternatives. And we're seeing a lot of contract share farming agreements, etc., that can be very successful and work well. But early dialogue and planning, I think, again, is critical.
It's key. Okay, so when Greg Ricketts, our head of farm business, was on the podcast, he said that he felt that the transition was accelerating the handover of agricultural assets to the next generation. I wonder if you agree with that statement, and what do you think the impact is going to be on the sector?
Okay, so I think certainly the agricultural transition period has accelerated it, but you could actually argue the other way. Had the old regime delayed it, and I would say there's probably equal weight to that conversation. So I think the previous sector, where people were receiving payments through the BPS, etc., meant that people were getting a regular and reliable income that actually meant that they could probably continue to farm without needing to consider change.
Yeah.
And certainly we've seen in the tenanted sector quite a significant start to people really considering what the future holds for them with the BPS, etc., moving. So I think the old regime delayed, but I think the new regime has created a real cliff edge for people to decide, do they really want to engage in the new world that we're entering into? And we're seeing the biggest transition in agriculture that I've certainly seen in my working career. And I think Greg probably said the same in his podcast. So that then leads to the question of, what does the future look like? And I think it's making businesses really stop and think about, what does the next 5, 10, 15 years look like? And is that something I want to be involved in? And I often speak to the younger generation who are quite excited about the prospects and what that brings and the opportunities. But equally, some of the senior members of the farming community probably less engaged in the opportunities, because they see that being for somebody else and for someone else to take forward, because it's not something they want to invest their time on or in. And so that is then bringing change, which I think is an exciting opportunity for the industry and the sector, but will obviously, as you quite rightly said, bring forward quite a lot of succession decisions that have maybe not come forward at the same rate previously.
Okay, so it's a great opportunity, isn't it? And there's lots of kind of exciting prospects for the future for those that are kind of willing to embrace the change.
Absolutely,
yeah.
I think, and I think we will see farming businesses really change and become rural businesses that produce food, deliver environmental goods, but also look way beyond that. And there'll be lots of opportunities for those businesses. And I think it's an exciting time.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time, Guy. There's been lots of really good advice in there, and hopefully it'll be very useful for those who are starting to think about embarking on that journey of succession. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.